I'd like to begin with, I think some of you may know of my work, some of my film work in particular over the last 13 or so years. And I do consider myself primarily a filmmaker still, although at the same time, like I think Sarah mentioned earlier on, that for me, film was really came from an understanding that I believe it's the most effective storytelling tool that we have. And so I think from an earlier age, I was really intrigued by storytelling, like many are. I mean, it's a very human thing, I think, but also the power of story to shift consciousness, to affect change, and to invite people to see differently. And I think for this talk today, I think the invitation really is that it's for me to offer what I've seen unfold over the last 13 or more years in terms of the big narratives that I think modern culture, particularly of course Canada and the US, have been sort of the foundation of the culture, and to begin to make visible these different narratives with the sense that that would allow you to be able to perhaps see them as just that, as narratives, and how narratives and story really create our world. And they're very powerful in that they can induce a way of seeing that many people can actually have very different understandings of the world based on the story that they're living, that there isn't just one master story. I think for me, I had one particular reckoning that happened, I think it was maybe about 10 years ago, when I was trying to be a good progressive greenie. And for many of us, it was the shift initially when the recycling bags, the grocery bags, there was a lot of encouragement going around here. I live, at the time I was in Vancouver, out on the West Coast, and there's a lot of encouragement to bring the recycled grocery bags in, because, again, it's a very good thing to do. We don't want plastic in the ocean, and it's a good way to kind of do your part. And I remember, again, going to the grocery store, bringing my bags, like doing the thing. And I remember after one afternoon when I came home, normally what I do is I take the bags, green grocery bags, and I put them into the closet in the home I was in at the time. And I remember going into the closet, and that I put the green bags, after I'd emptied the groceries, I put the green bags in a bag that I have in the closet for these recycled grocery bags. And I remember that the grocery bags at that point were kind of overflowing. And so there'd come a time when the amount of recycled grocery bags I had were actually now spilling out over beyond the capacity. I had to keep buying them, I guess, or keep requiring them. And I think something just clicked for me. Something about, again, a very simple ritual or a simple act that was put forward by the kind of progressive green perspective, that this kind of thing, that if we could reduce, recycle, reuse the rest, that would somehow be enough. Like that was the problem with overconsumption, with biospheric degradation, all the rest. If we could just do this and many other things, change light bulbs, all the rest, that would be enough. And I remember thinking at that time, like, wow, like something's amiss. Like there's something about the fact that I was piling up on these recycled grocery bags that kind of clicked for me. And I realized that there was something wasn't going deep enough, if I could maybe say it that way, that there was something about the response to these times that didn't feel that it was going deep enough. And it was around that time actually that I turned to the computer, just sort of in a kind of a haze of wondering, what was I realizing? And I actually found online, somebody had posted a passage to a book at the time called The Ascent of Humanity, which was by an author then still relatively obscure at the time, but his name was Charles Eisenstein. And I remember reading what he wrote, and really he actually spoke directly to this piece, which is, one could say coincidence or synchronicity. And the piece that he spoke to was this idea that, I think he was quoting Audre Lorde. He said, "The master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house." And I think what that spoke to, and further that he wrote, was that the ways of dealing with the crisis, the mounting crisis, are themselves coming from the same way of thinking and the same way of being that caused the crisis. And from there, it's that and I think Einstein may have a similar quote, something about, you cannot respond to the times with the same level of thinking that created the problems, something along those lines. And so for me, what that awoke was this sense of like, okay, what are we not seeing? What am I not seeing in terms of these grand stories? And I believe I then realized, I picked up the book. It's quite a thick book, I think 600 pages or 400 or something. But what he spoke to was this idea of there was two main stories that were animating modern civilization. One is the story of separation, which is this sense of who you are as a human being. And how it goes is that, from a kind of modern scientific perspective, rational, intellectual, scientific perspective, materialist, that, what you are is essentially a discrete being, sort of an ego encased in flesh and floating around in the universe and the world, acting primarily upon rational self-interest. And that ultimately, most people want to do good, but really at the end of the day, they're kind of out for themselves. And as much as individuals may want to live differently, if that's what we are, then really we are separate from the rest of life. I'm not saying this is a true story. What I'm saying is that if one was able to peel back the surface of civilization, this is by and large the story that we live by, whether we want to or not. The other story is what he called the story of ascension, which is this idea that it's the idea of linear progress. That, if you look back in history, we see humans came from the days of cavemen and then, developed language and symbology and the rest, and culture and technology, and that we have been on an ascent from caveman all the way to the stars, and that it is our destiny to become lords and masters of nature. And again, this is the story of progress that's built into every level of our current civilization. And now the problem with that, again, becomes clear when you're able to, on the way, sidestep and step outside of that. And then you start to see it as the story. And then you begin to realize, what is the consequence of living this story? And also, therefore, what ways of understanding meaning come from this story? And so for me, I would say, I first encountered that understanding when I read Charles's book. And from there, some other things had happened right around that time. This is around 2011. The Occupy movement happened, of course, from New York. And then actually it was inspired by Tunisia and Spain and Egypt, of course, and finally Wall Street. And those who may have been tracking that journey at the time, as I was with another filmmaker, working on a film which became Occupy Love, the understanding was that, while many in the US at the time, as Wall Street happened, they had this sense of, a lot of the commentary came out, what do these hippies want? Like, where do they come from? Get a job, all this kind of stuff. Whereas I think it was Naomi Klein, the author of Shock Doctrine, among other books. And she said, well, those in the US maybe are saying, like, what do these guys want? The rest of the world is saying, what took you so long? Because it was very much a passing of the torch of really, what Charles has said, this longing for the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And even if those at the time, and maybe that included some of you, didn't fully understand, what this impulse was pointing to, I think economic justice was certainly one thing that it was about, debt and the recession, 2008 bailouts and all the rest. But there was something deeper. I think it was Rolling Stone had a quote around that time of the movement. They said it was the first time that people had gone on strike from their own culture, which I love that articulation. There was this sense of like, wait, where are we going? People had this sense of like, wherever we were going was no longer, there was a real consequence that was starting to show itself, and people wanted to, in a way, like put on the brakes. And yet the momentum, of course, of the civilization is so deep that it can be very difficult to do so. And anyone that wants to and puts themselves out there, as Occupy did, faces some pretty harsh repercussions. And so that film was Occupy Love, which again came out the year after that, tracked the first year of the Wall Street movement. And from there, I started to continue to look at, like, what are the stories that I see sort of bubbling up around the world that were offering a different way of understanding these times. And that took me from places like Burning Man, in the Nevada desert, maybe some of you have been, and Fukushima in Japan after 3/11, the partial meltdown of the nuclear plant, and to another place called Tamera in Portugal, which is a sort of a 200-person community that is really trying to live into, what are the ways in which we can really live together that create peace, that rebuild relationship. And that film is called Love School, which is still in the works and should be out in this fall. But really that became my task, I felt, was to seek out these different narratives and begin to uncover and amplify them for the wider global conversation. So I want to ask now, maybe that's just a brief sort of flyby of certainly my work and what I've been trying to do from that perspective. And I want to ask to all of you, maybe to wonder about, which is, what is the function of story? Just want you to think about that for a second. And I asked it deliberately in that way. What is the function of story? Or what does story do? And I want to make a differentiation too between the sense that some of you may know sort of oral tradition storytellers. They often dabble in what's understood, I think I understand, to be myth telling, which is where they'll tell a specific story from their particular cultural tradition, whether it's Celtic or indigenous, all the rest. And that's one understanding of the living application or the living relationship to story. And then there's this other level of story as well, which is really, I think it's a way of seeing story, or a way of seeing with a mythic imagination. I believe it might have been Robert Bly, the poet, who first said that. And I think one of the challenges that we're living in now, especially as we look out at modernity, is that really the mythic imagination has become withered. People often will see, literally, or be unable to see the myths that are actually guiding the understandings that we have, and then how do we find meaning in it? And so, for me, what I came to understand is the function of story is to give meaning to the times. To give meaning to the times. Because what it does is it situates where you fit into it, where we all fit in. What is the identity, or what is the understanding of humanity? Like, what is our role here on this planet? What do we owe or not to other beings? What does it mean to be a good person? Right? All of these questions, or all of these ways of deriving meaning, can come from that understanding. And I would like to turn now to understanding, looking at now, like, what is this moment, this COVID-19 crisis moment that we're in? And, as Sarah, I think, mentioned earlier, that the invitation was to come out to Red Deer to speak with you all directly. And, it was that feels like a long time ago now, a few weeks, certainly. And the world looked very different then. And it's surprising, actually, how quickly things can change. And one of the things that I've been fascinated by is actually tracking the narratives that have been emerging from seeing how the media is portraying, how commentary is coming out around, like, what is this moment? And how do we understand what COVID is, our relationship to it? And I want to sketch a few of these perspectives, or sketch a few of these narratives that are present. And before I sketch them as well, I don't want to say that any of these are necessarily like true or not true, because again, it's this question about what happens to you depending on which story you connect with, or that you feel to be true. What happens when you connect to each of these stories? So one of the main narratives that has come out with this time and with the coronavirus is that we are at war. I've seen this narrative, this pop up quite a bit now in a lot of the commentary, and I read the New York Times pretty ongoingly, and other sources, and a lot of the language that's coming out, particularly from governments, is that we're at war with this thing, with this virus. And that induces a sense of, a great calamity that is befallen us. But it also it kind of creates a narrative of a fight. Obviously, that's what war is. It's a fight against an opponent, and there's something just kind of deeply important, I think, to examine around this idea of using this time, putting it in a war metaphor or a war narrative, because this does not come out of nowhere. Like the narrative of war does not sort of emerge. It's not novel to this idea of the current human relationship to the rest of life. Because one could look out at the destruction that's going on, ongoingly, obviously over now many decades in particular, looking at the biospheric collapse and, of course, climate change and global warming and all the rest. The bushfires, of course, in Australia that were raging out of control. And one could easily make the case, actually, from the side of the Earth, that it's humans that are at war with the Earth and with the rest of life. Now, I'm not saying that Earth thinks that, but if someone was simply to make the case of this idea of opponent against another, one could easily make that case to say that the way in which civilization has conducted itself, by and large, seems to be at war with the Earth. Now, why is that? And is that inherently how all humans, peoples, have understood to be their relationship to the rest of Earth, to be at war with it? And I would say, no, of course, that's not the case. I think it would be accurate to say that the nature of being indigenous, and the word indigenous could be translated as to belong to a place, is really what that means. And yes, I know I sometimes hear the commentary around, people will say, well, we're all indigenous to Earth, and so we're indigenous. And on one level, yes, that's true. And there is something really important to make a distinction between those peoples currently that still have a relationship to their place, to their ancestral place, as being still active in their indigenous nature. And I would say that the nature of therefore being indigenous is that a place is where you derive your identity from. So your relationship to place is of vital importance. And I would say that this idea that you are at war with the place is not part of an indigenous understanding of what is the role of humans, why are we here, and what is our relationship to the rest of life. And so what had to happen, basically, that modernity would come to an understanding that essentially life is out to get us. I was in Tamera, as I mentioned, the eco-village in Portugal last year in May, and there was a fellow from Cameroon. His name's Joshua. He was a fellow who ran a eco-village as well in Cameroon, in particular for, I think, younger people, doing some really incredible work. And at the same time, there was war that had broken out in the area, and so he had to leave for a time and take shelter, actually. And the Tamarans invited him to stay, and that's where I met him. And he was an older fellow, very sort of reflective, and had a kind of quiet gravitas. And I remember over the dinner one night speaking to him and kind of asking him about his story, and just what he thought about being here and what the work they were doing at Tamera in his own place. And at one point he leaned back and he kind of looked at me and he said, "Civilization makes you afraid of everything. Civilization makes you afraid of everything," he said. And there was something about that just like detonated me. Because it wasn't like an indictment or like a judgment so much, but it was more like a kind of naming of the truth of the setup. It is that essentially civilization is a project that is against the rest of life, but it can only do that by making you afraid. I'm not saying anybody's doing it on purpose, but what happens when you lose relationship to place and to our own sense of meaning in the world, then everything else becomes scary. Everything else outside the rim, of the campfire of our human realm becomes scary, and anything that encroaches upon it becomes out to try to get us. It becomes at war with us. And so again, you can see this relationship between the further away we get from relationship to the rest of life, the more that life seems out to get us. And I would maybe make the case that with COVID-19, that there's something else afoot. There's something else afoot. One of the other narratives that has come out, and again, I've explored in cursorily and somewhat, and by no means I'm an expert in millions of variations of theories that have come out. There's also the sense that it's artificially generated, and there's a cabal of shadowy types that have manufactured this to create total lockdown and one world government and all the rest. And there's rabbit holes to go down, certainly, and I've spent some of that time there. And again, not to dismiss any of that, but to say again, what do you become when you connect to different stories? What about that story validates the sense that that this is particularly done to us or done to you, and that there's a kind of fear of, again, further control, further encroachment of control, of lockdown, of separation and isolation, all the rest. Not saying that the consequence of all of this separation and isolation certainly is becoming more apparent upon us. But again, there's something in that narrative that I find that it becomes harder to connect with, what to do about it in a meaningful way. And I want to bring to the third narrative, which I feel is most alive right now during this time. And I'm curious to know, again, like, how does this land for people as well? Those of you who've been tracking these different stories. And how to enter. I think to say that, it's not hard to see that life has been in trouble for some time. I think probably everybody on this call, nobody has to make the case that that's true or not. I think all of you are probably aware life has been in trouble for some time because largely of the activity and the busyness of humans. And it's not a stretch to say that, if we keep continuing as we have been, trying to kind of tweak the system as we go here and there, it's hard to believe that meaningful, significant action would have been taken in time to really adjust our priorities as a human species. It's hard to believe that in the way things have been going. And so now come upon us, a global pandemic with this COVID-19. And in many ways as well, the very real destruction and suffering that has come about because of it. Certainly those who have family members affected, those who have deaths, within their family or connected to them, particularly in places where, it's really run rampant. I mean, not to dismiss or downplay the level of pain and suffering that is also present within them. And I would say that one of the narratives that's emerging is that here is a moment to really reflect upon, again, what is this time for, or what is the highest possibility of a kind of reimagining what's possible for the human relationship to the rest of life. That could it be that COVID-19 and the coronavirus is actually a moment of pause, or as I heard one phrase used, the great slowdown, to be able to find our breath, to be able to actually reflect, to reorient our priorities actually as a species, and to bring in deep creativity and imagination into what is to come next. Because I think that if, a few weeks from now, or a few months from now, let's say that normal returns, I think that would be a great tragedy for the rest of life, actually. That would be a great tragedy for the rest of life. Because then it's business as usual and destruction continues. And then, of course, down the line, these kinds of things will keep happening and the biosphere will buckle even more. But I think we have a real possibility now to think about what do we want to bring to this time. And maybe I invite that all of you as well, listening to this now, is taking it away from the big, macro picture, but actually connecting now to the personal. What is it about this time that, whatever your situation is, and again, I hope you're staying safe. I hope you're, doing the hand washing, all that stuff. And what is it that life is asking of you in this time? One way to think of it is, again, relinquishing the idea that you're supposed to be doing constantly, and maybe pushing away that quiet existential voice that is saying, hey, it's time to listen. It's time to listen to what am I most called to do? Because I think the level of uncertainty also in this time is that it's hard to bank on a future which you thought, would be. I mean, who knows, right? What may come. And therefore, I think there's a real moment here to wonder, and hopefully, you got maybe some people close by, maybe not too close, to wonder about actually what it is that you might do in your own life to reorient. And to use this time that, like perhaps this idea of the great slowdown is in fact life's intelligent response to say, hey, humans, you've gone off track so far, and you really threaten the rest of life in your action, in your momentum. And I'm trying to get you to awaken to that you have to come back home, right? Humans, like, you have to come back home. You have to come back into relationship with the rest of life. And that means it's not a war to be won anymore, but it's like an invitation to really slow down, to reflect, and to come back to what is worth doing. So I'm going to pause now. That's about 30 minutes or so. And I would love to hear from some of you if you wanted to share some of your questions on the chat thread, if you type them out, and then maybe Sarah could hop back on as well and could help sort of field some of the questions and then I can hopefully respond to some of them.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Thanks for that. Definitely enjoying the narrative of the great slowdown. And I think I would prefer to connect to that story than any of the others.
Yeah. Maybe as people speak too, and if you're open, Sarah, to maybe tracking and inviting some of the questions through the text too, maybe I could add as well that maybe one last story here, which is, I studied with another fellow, some of you may know, his name's Stephen Jenkinson. And I've been studying with him a number of years. I made a few short films about his work as well. One in particular that was released last year called Lost Nation Road, which is about a live show between him and a fellow musician, Gregory Hoskin. But Steve actually spent a lot of time in the palliative care trade for a number of years, actually, at a major Canadian hospital. And so developed a lot of the program around palliative care. And what he learned then from that time, and essentially where does death phobia come from, was really a question that he was alive for him at the time, because what he saw again and again at the deathbeds of so many people, even if they said a lot of people say to you, you might say, oh, are you afraid to die? And many will say, oh, no, I'm fine, make it quick, no problem. Or even religious, those with a religious background can say, yeah, like I'm connected to spirit, and when the time comes, I'll be ready. And what happened though was that often he saw again and again what he called a rampant death phobia would show up right near the brink. And so he began again asking the question, where does that come from? Is it normal? Like, do all human cultures have that understanding of what death is? And again, going back to the story of how meaning is derived. And I think it's safe to say that in a culture where the idea of limit is itself like an injustice, the idea if limit is an injustice, that it shouldn't be, and I can apply it again to this idea of the civilization as a linear progress into the future and ultimate control. That means any limit that is encountered along that journey to full domination is meant to be overcome and smashed and destroyed, and all the rest. And because limit is seen as in opposition to that relationship to life. And yet, from a different understanding, and dare I say, more indigenous understanding, is that limit is how life is saying, don't go any further, because the consequence of going further will accrue to everything else. And that is what we've seen happen, is that as we've circumvented every limit that is placed before us en masse with technology and all the rest, what's happened is the consequences then spilled over into the rest of life, into future generations. And so this time is really an invitation to sense of like what there's an intelligence to limits, and that it's not an injustice that death comes, right? Is what he says. It's the difference between death being an angel and death being an executioner. And whatever story you're living in that means that's how that moment will be. Will it be slipping into oblivion and goneness, right? In a culture that no longer has a deep relationship to their ancestors and to the sense of being gathered in on the other side, then again, it's a deeply scary moment that doesn't happen for all cultures. But it seems to accrue specifically to modern culture because we've lost those ties in that deeper relationship. So I see Sarah, yeah, we've had some questions coming on in. And I could just maybe start going down the list. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, great. So I see here, yeah, the return of normal would be great tragedy for the rest of life, and also for civilized humans. Yeah, thanks. I guess it's a bit more of a comment on that. But I agree as well, because, you know, again, if we think about how many people sort of go along with the story, because that's just the way it is. And yet at the same time, I think it's easy to see that so many people have a kind of existential terror or existential hole, you know, at the core, that often is the thing to distract from, you know, whether that's watching TV all the time or even, you know, working too much, which is something, you know, often I get into. But really that there's this existential hole that so much of what modern civilization offers to fill that hole is a counterfeit. It's a pseudo offering and doesn't really fill that deep longing, which wants to come back into relationship with the rest of life. And that's why it would also be a tragedy if, you know, at the end of this thing that suddenly, you know, we get back to it and then we're right back there again. And so I just want to offer too that this, to shift this understanding too, that, you know, some people have maybe a kind of deep cynicism often around humanity, to say, you know, I mean, maybe I'm speaking, I know some family members as well that are like this, that there's the cynicism that says humans are inherently greedy, that, you know, I don't know, they're dumb. I don't know why they continue to, you know, to hurt the environment, hurt each other, go to war, all the rest. And at the same time, I think it's important to see that, you know, this overconsumption and this need to have more and all the rest is really a symptom. It's not a cause. It's a symptom. And to address the symptom is actually to address the ways in which we can come back into relationship once again with each other and with the earth. And then from there, this desire to accumulate and hoard and all the rest naturally actually begins to relax, because that deeper place of need and longing is being met. I'm going to read a couple more now. Actually, you know what would be helpful is, Sarah, you know, I don't have my glasses, actually. So if you could actually read the next one, and then I can respond that way.
Yeah, no problem. So there's just a comment saying, I enjoyed that film with Stephen Jenkinson.
Thank you.
And then, so the next one from Cynthia. I sense that we do not know where the virus arose from, but I feel that it may have arose through the vibration of imbalance, fear, loss, regret, insecurity, and uncertainty. If COVID did arise out of such a vibration, then maybe it could be transformed through a vibration of love, sharing, caring, respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a beautiful sentiment. And yeah, and I, you know, even as I connect to that story and like tap into it, I feel a sense of expansiveness, a sense of desire to connect and to be of service, and to yeah, to come from a different place than, you know, fear and anxiety. And so I think at the same time, you know, it's this relationship between sort of pragmatism, but also recognizing that there is this mythic layer to what's going on. And so how do we hold both? So, you know, how do you wash your hands and try not to touch your face, as much as possible, and hold this, again, this expansive relationship to recognizing, oh, this is an invitation actually to slow down, to reflect, to be of service, right? Especially, it's easy to connect obviously this way through Zoom and with others, which is beautiful. And to think about even in your local communities, in your local places, kind of like re-bringing attention, back to regenerating relationship to the place. And again, it's tough now. It's a weird paradox, obviously, right? Because, in a crisis moment when we actually want to, I think, connect with each other and find each other in small groups, which is a very human thing to do, we're also being asked to distance and to isolate and all the rest. And so, again, it's in some ways, it's really highlighting the preciousness of human connection. And that, in times to come, ideally when we're allowed to, quote, gather again, that really maybe that preciousness is not lost, that we really recognize how necessary and vital that is to our way of just being human.
So next comment from Haiti, I would like to address the disconnect issue from self. I believe that is what makes this epidemic more scary for people.
Yeah, the disconnection from self. It's interesting, I'll just maybe offer something around that that comes to me, which is that why is it that, why would somebody do something that they don't really want to do, right? Again, if you think of the current economic system, those of you who saw my short film, Sacred Economics, which we shared yesterday, if you haven't seen it yet, highly recommend, check it out. Just Google Sacred Economics, Charles Eisenstein. And in that film, what he talks about is how the current economic system, it is not neutral, you could say. Like, it has a certain value system, a certain story that is that it lives in. And that story, by and large, is that actions that perpetuate the system are valued above actions and jobs and the rest that don't perpetuate the system. And so, I know a lot of artists and healers and all the rest that oftentimes have a real, challenging relationship to the system, of course, because on the one hand, they want to give their gifts and they want to support others. And at the same time, they have a really hard time often raising funds and being supported to make a living. And that can often come into their own identity. And they have a feeling of, oh, look, because my offerings aren't valued in this culture, then I'm not valued. I don't have that much value. And I really want to encourage for people that, it is important to step outside of that and say that the system itself actually doesn't value the things that we actually want to give, that we actually want to offer the world. It values the things that perpetuate the system. And so if we could decouple that sense of your own value and what you want to bring from what the economic system currently values, then you're able to see, oh, wow, those things that you do want to bring are absolutely vital, actually, because I do believe that's coming from life itself that is saying, hey, like, this is yours to do. We need you to do this. And ideally, the economic system is able to catch up to the economic system is able to actually bring wind in the sails of that kind of human nature, of which I do think is the promise of this time, believe it or not. Because currently, with the coronavirus ravaging, cross-sector, cross, class, all the rest, that it's pretty clear that, the extent of the ripples and the impact means that, the sort of normal ways of doing things are sort of out the window. And I think it just makes clear what was already there, which is that largely the system itself is arbitrary based on agreements that aren't, a kind of sacred order, but are often manipulated, obviously heavily, from this idea of the intelligence of the market that is somehow, the hand of God. But actually, especially with the bailouts happening all in other sectors, so it's just very clear that that there's ways of just bringing imagination and creativity to a very different system. And Sacred Economics, the short that I spoke to, he really articulates beautifully, actually, what a different system would look like that is aligned with our gifts. And so for that question there, I just look to that and say, yeah, I think it's a real task to begin to decouple from the conditioning and what the system has wanted you to do, or maybe you had to do and have to do because putting food on the table, you maybe got a family, and the rest, and just begin to lean into, but wait, there's this deeper voice of the self, which is actually connected to life, and to bring orientation to that place.
So next comment, there's a few more questions coming in here. So this is from Robin.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Ian, so if you are willing, could you speak to the idea of a global initiation as per some of Charles Eisenstein's ideas around this?
Mm-hmm.
Could this event be one of those opportunities for us to initiate into a more mature, aware species?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Robin. I would say, yeah, this to me is essentially the meta narrative that has been going on sort of under the surface of, of these other narratives for some time. And I personally really like it. I think it's a very powerful narrative, and I would love to use this moment to sketch it. But it'll take just a couple minutes to sketch out the story. So many cultures, intact cultures today still, and of course cultures that were more indigenous and connected to the rest of life, understood that at every stage of a development and threshold of the life of a human, that they had to be marked with rites of passage, which is the term often given to them. From child to adult, from becoming parents, becoming stepping into elderhood, all of these ways in which there was meant to be a ceremonial marking that threshold. So in particular, this shift from adolescent to adult was a very important, and is a very important threshold. And on this individual level, the relationship to the individual in the culture is so much of modern culture no longer practices initiation. So no longer marks that stage from when the youth becomes an adult. And I may ask, I work with men often a lot of the time, and I'll say, when did you know you became a man? And some might say, oh, well, when I had my first beer, or when my dad, I don't know, invited me to, sit with the other men, or maybe it was lots of these ways, right? But it wasn't, none of them said, oh, it was this ceremony that was given to me in a way, in a significant way that I knew, now I've become a man. And there's a kind of a social realm to that, but there's also a deeper sort of mythic, egoic relationship to that threshold, which I myself am in a multi-year initiatory process with a teacher. And part of that is being outside for a period of time with no food and no water. It's a sort of a often turned to ceremonial journey for a lot of cultures. They have this kind of thing, the fast. And what I'll say is, by being out there for that amount of time and really stepping into a moment of, in a way, making oneself visible to the rest of life by being willing for a very short period of time, not to be willing to take. Just that, not to be willing to take anymore. No food, no water for just a short period. And what happened was, from that time was, one, I began to kind of slow to a point of, being out there that long outside, you begin to, in a way, attune to the pace of nature, that the speed at which nature moves at. And you attend to a lot of tiny details, which when you move too quickly, as which most humans do, you miss, because you're simply going too fast in order to recognize the ways that nature has of being itself. And so it took me that long even to attune to the speed at which nature moves. And what I began to recognize was that it has its own way, that nature has its own way. And my teacher said to me in that time after, and this goes back to this idea of what is the relationship of humans to nature? Because if the way of nature is simply to be itself, of which humans are part of, then when nature encroaches upon human endeavor and initiative and the desire to be champions of everything, does that inherently mean that nature is against us? And I would say, no, it doesn't actually. It means nature is just being itself. And that humans have the ability to make that decision to say, this doesn't mean it's against us. It means that it's just trying to be nature. And we don't have to come into opposition for it, even as we deal with the consequence of big things, whether it's pandemics or floods or forest fires and all the rest. And so I've come back to the sense that, so what is going on en masse, that as we begin to revitalize and bring forth initiations again at the level of the personal, I know many others who are beginning to try to reawaken those rites of passage. What happens is you recognize that your relationship, even personally, that your relationship to nature is that it's just much bigger than you, and it doesn't mean you're insignificant. It doesn't mean you're nothing. It just means that it's a much bigger story than any individual human life, and even of all of humanity. And so this idea that it's humans, lords and masters of everything, the promise of this moment, this great slowdown, is that perhaps perhaps the modern world, the civilization project, could come to an existential point of facing the possibility of its own demise. And that doesn't mean nothing. It doesn't mean total apocalyptic meltdown, but the willingness to accept a limit that we don't know, and that we're not supposed to be in control, but we are supposed to be in relationship. And this is the promise. This is what Charles has spoken to archetypally. He speaks about the shift from whereas an indigenous relationship has often been characterized as Mother Earth. Of course, that story of Mother Earth, that she is the great mother that all comes from, we are sustained by. And that we have this moment, an opportunity before us to step through that threshold and come into a relationship which may be characterized as lover Earth. And what does it mean to come into a mature relationship to Earth and actually really come into co-creative partnership in a way that I don't think we've actually seen before, the level of partnership that's possible by utilizing the great gifts of our technology to be in relationship with Earth instead of dominating. To source, like, what does she want actually? What is her longings, and how do we be in relationship with that and actually partner, and what could come from that? And so this time as a great initiation, to me, is the story that I feel the most resonant with, and I think offers the most possibility about how we may navigate this time of change.
Just have to find the next comment here from Andrew. Thank you, Ian, for articulating so clearly what has been trying to crystallize in my mind lately. Reminds me of what some of my Indigenous colleagues say, that natural disasters, floods, fires, etc., are the earth cleansing and smudging herself, connecting us humans with a loving and guiding hand. I would be very interested in thinking about where the leverage points are and how this situation could catalyze systemic change in the relationship between human communities, their economies, and all life.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you. It's I would wager here. Here's a couple that come to mind. One is that I think I posted recently on my thread, but this conversation around universal basic income, which is also named in sacred economics, as a significant shift that I think is vital now because of what's happened. Some of you may already know about this, and I think it's important to recognize that why hasn't it been instituted? Like, why hasn't the accrued wealth of all of our work that largely is directed by the government or funneled into corporate endeavors, why isn't that possible to share? And I would say that it's because the story of the current economic system is in some ways deeply cynical about human nature, because it says humans only operate on self-interest, and therefore to incentivize self-interest is the way that everybody wins. That's the kind of market ideology. But there's a very different understanding of humanity, or a different system would emerge if you proceeded with this understanding that humans want to give their gifts. Imagine you started there. Okay, so humans inherently actually are generative in giving. So how do we design an economic system that would support people to give the gifts and do the things they actually want to do and serve? Now you start to recognize it's not about maybe fixing the existing marketplace as it is, with a lot of the bailouts and a lot of the stuff that's now starting to be talked about. Maybe in the interim, yeah, that's great. But it's something like universal basic income, which basically just means that everybody has the foundation of what they need to live, to survive. Nobody's on the street because they can't participate. But from that understanding, now it creates a very different story that invites people into a world where they are asked to give their gifts. And even just to think about how that might be, imagine musicians, people that love to play music, didn't have to compete in the marketplace for making a buck and to just get by. Imagine a street in the city where people would just bring their performances and their gifts just because it felt good to do, and because they didn't have an existential fear that they wouldn't have food on the table. For example, imagine that. Imagine art in every corner, because there's people what they love to do. And then some other people say, well, who's going to take out the garbage? And on the one hand, I mean, that may be true, but in a different world where every role is seen as deeply in service to a larger paradigm of relationship and beauty, then you recognize that everybody can do most things for a period of time, like half a day, let's say. It's not a 10-hour slog, or like many people in the developing is a suspect word, but in manufacturing, of course, that work many long hours for pennies just to get by. And we start to wonder again, like why do we have a system that's actually seen as valuable? So it takes an utter reorientation to looking at it systemically, I think, but then also what are the stories that we actually want to live by? And then how do our systems sort of give wind in the sails and enliven those stories, rather than trying to fix the stories that already have deeply embedded cynical understanding of human nature within them? How do we support the human nature that we know is possible?
So next question from Susan. I am wondering how to create an opportunity to discuss how we can help each other. I have been finding that people are overwhelmed and still retreating into themselves. I am hoping to find the words to invite others to brainstorm together on how we can serve each other and the greater community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, again, it's really interesting times, because again, we have this impulse, I think, to gather in terms of crisis and come together. And yet at the same time, we're now being asked not to. So it kind of creates a kind of stunted ability to just connect in close proximity and to see what wants to come. But I also think too that oftentimes, when people do want to support or kind of come up with the plan or the idea of what to do about it, oftentimes it can I don't know, it can be too heady, or it's hard to get a lot of people to agree on things. And maybe, if one was able to actually tune in deeply to maybe a group, let's say you call all of your neighbors together on Zoom, ideally, in this moment, and say, hey, we got to come up with a plan. But maybe the plan is just to simply listen to each other and say, hey, how is everybody feeling? What's true for you now? What do you fear? What's actually your deepest longing that would be most generative and beautiful now, right? And maybe you'd be surprised actually at what comes, because maybe it's not, come up with the plan yet to, create a systemic, total new paradigm. But maybe in that moment, it's just, hey, let's sing together. Let's tell stories together. Maybe that's enough, in this moment. So I would say, I would invite a kind of starting from a deep listening, and starting from maybe what the actual needs are when you begin to gather and call people in, rather than maybe going too quickly to the big plan, because again, often that can be overwhelming. And there's an incredible book I just want to recommend to everybody called Emergent Strategy by a woman named Adrienne Marie Brown from Detroit. Emergent Strategy. And she has beautiful principles of what she calls this emergent strategy. But she just talks about this idea that, whoever gathers in any moment, there's something that they themselves are meant to do, that only that group can do in that moment. And that the role of that group is to find out what that thing is actually in that moment to do. What is theirs to do? And maybe it's make beauty, and maybe it's come up with a big plan, right? But to just attune to that instead of maybe showing up with a sense of what's supposed to happen, and just come together and deeply listen.
Next question from Cynthia. Would you feel comfortable talking about how looking at COVID through the lens of quantum physics changes or presents a new story?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I'll say I'm very cursory knowledgeable about quantum physics. I think I heard on the second half of that question, though, maybe this sense about, how does the perception change reality? Or maybe that's one way I could take the question. And what I might offer is, again, this idea that, what are we? Are we just sort of egoic, self-interested beings floating around in the universe, and that there is an objective reality out there that somehow it continues on without us as a kind of mechanistic view of the universe tells us that we are, and sort of rational scientific understanding? Or are we relational beings that, in fact, the world is in relation to us as we are in relation to it? And so from that understanding, the stories that we live by and that we see, in a way, the stories precede our way of seeing. So when we look to the world, if we look at what COVID quote is or what's happening, right? If we believe that, maybe unconsciously, that nature is out to get us, then what we will see with COVID now is a war. We will see a war that we're meant to win. Or if we see that this is a kind of plea from life to humans that's saying, slow down, guys. Like, slow down. You know where you're going. You don't know anymore. Like, you're doing too much damage. Slow down. All of a sudden, that reality will then govern your actions and how you see yourself, right? And what's worth doing. And maybe how you see other people's reactions to it. And so you can choose to live into that story as well. And perhaps in that sense, that therefore actions that you take will change reality as it is, actually. And so from that, if that's perhaps a kind of quantum relationship understanding, that people can be living in the same moment. People can have two different stories about what's happening, and often do. And therefore, it's also not, this is a key piece too, it's not about dominating people who believe differently, but it's actually inviting them into, maybe to make visible or to connect with the story that they're living. So for example, if somebody feels we're at war with COVID, and that's the narrative they hold, we're at war, we have to beat this thing, then you might ask them, like, wow, it sounds like, there's a lot of fear in your voice. It sounds scary, like that understanding. And maybe they might say, yeah, I am afraid, actually. And then maybe, but you start from that connection. You don't say, we're not at war, it's medicine for the planet, and how come you don't see this? You're not enlightened. Like, wake up, sheeple. Of course, that often isn't that helpful to people to try to dominate their narratives, but you can invite them in to a place of to connection and wondering. And I feel that's a much more efficient way of bringing in people to a new possibility. So again, hopefully that's a bit of a question I could offer from that point. Yep. I think I see Sarah's, like, there we go.
Sorry, I was muted. From Haiti, could we talk more about the process of communication that needs to happen during this transition?
Process of communication. Yeah, maybe you could type a little bit more from that question. I'm not sure I fully grasp. And maybe if you typed in the thread a little bit more, and then we can come back to that question. So maybe Sarah, if you'd be willing to read the next, and then once we have a bit more info, I could respond.
Yeah, sounds good. So just a couple comments here. A gift of making a labyrinth, and to comment from Susan, just about how there are people whose gifts are to handle waste products. Just looking for if there's any other questions here. So from Doreen, thank you for your astute insights and reflections. I love that you mentioned the importance of story. Our storytelling organization, Storytelling Alberta, just launched a program of story delivery by phone during the pandemic. We will tell 5 to 10-minute stories to any Albertan as an antidote to social distancing.
Beautiful. Maybe I could offer something on that too. Is I live in a collective home here as well, so we often are in research about just how to be together, what builds trust, and what brings healing. And one of the things that we did not that long ago was we came to this understanding just by listening to the moment was that for something like 3 days, that all we would do was give each other the space to tell our story, just to tell our life story, and whatever that meant to us, from childhood on to the moment. And the rest of us would just listen, give full attention, and then at the end, ask questions, about what was stirred, curiosities, and the rest. All in all, it maybe take about an hour-ish, per person, with breaks in between. But there was something so profoundly healing, actually, about the willingness for a number of people, not many, to just give full attention to somebody to tell their story. And the healing that came from that alone, of really feeling seen, of feeling a sense of the narrative arc of one's own life, no matter their age, was profound. And so, again, I want to offer that actually maybe as a practice for those of you also maybe who have, let's say, a lot of time in your hands possibly, to invite or to gather with a few others. And maybe that's part of a practice you can do. Just invite each other to, hey, I'd love to hear your life story, and we'll just listen and see what comes. And again, what a profound moment and opportunity in this great slowdown to have that kind of quote time, for so many of us maybe who are busy, and the idea of having quote free time never seems possible, but now maybe it is possible. And again, we can find these really simple ways of just coming back into relationship and contact and rebuilding true relationship.
Nice. So just a little bit further from Haiti on the process of communication, now that you've made us aware of our disconnect, what other sources of unity could we utilize during these times of isolation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. I think it's profound actually to think about how, these technologies of connection through the web and video and face is amazing. I mean, especially now, I'm trying to imagine, if we didn't have this, certainly for those that live even more isolated. And I would say, again, it does depend on your circumstance. I saw some video, I think it was in Italy, where, I'm sure most people have heard of the, singing to each other across the balconies at night. But I've also saw like a personal trainer from their apartment, actually on the balcony, giving training, like personal training direction, leading classes actually from their balcony to their neighbors on the other side. And they were on the balcony as well, doing the push-ups and all the rest. And what a beautiful offering that's very specific to that person that can make that connection. And so again, I think there is something about the circumstance that you're in, depending on how close you are to other people. I think that yes, there are a lot of creative, imaginative ways are emerging on things like coming together for story time, for maybe reading poetry to each other, to happy hours, to all the rest. I mean, it's really open in that sense, creating a kind of intimacy best we can in the midst of this social isolation. So I want to encourage that it's sort of sky's the limit, I suppose, within the realm of what's possible with technology. And then also, though, I think I don't want to maybe underplay though how important it is to use this time consciously, even in one's own relationship to oneself, right? And to spend the time, maybe journaling a lot if you don't really do that, or look at practices. I think there's books like The Artist's Way that really give kind of path to really thinking about what are my gifts really, what is my story? Using this time as a really great reflection into, how have I got to where I am right now? Really giving yourself permission to like deeply to work from a disciplined place of understanding, more deeply. And then that way, I think you can also stave off a kind of running from, sort of panic to panic, to bring a sort of intentionality as to this time. in a way that maybe didn't first occur. And so, again, I mean, and as restrictions may ease or not, I know China, they've started to ease a lot and people are able to go outside more. And so who knows, again, depending on where you are, how it will open up again. But if you have access to nature as well, that's a huge piece of it too, right? That, so much of the human loneliness actually comes from the idea that, we're alone in the universe, and that life is just, a bunch of stuff and, pretty from time to time, but ultimately it's just stuff that we manipulate for our own ends. And, a lot of indigenous cultures have this understanding that the rest of life and every being, they're people too. And they actually often use the word people when they say, the tree people and the beaver people. And like they understand them to be, they're not human, but they're still people. And again, using this time to really connect and to be willing to see and to come back into relationship, I think will, even if it's quote you in the forest, of course, like then if you're able to see and feel that you are surrounded by people, it's not human. That for me has come into just a deep, profound sense of connection and belonging again to the rest of life.
So there's just a couple of additional comments here. Thank you for this. Great to hear some positive forward human progression in these times of awakening. And from Corinne, love the idea of telling life stories and conscious listening. This will translate well to a newly established Facebook Messenger video group among a dozen of us who are missing regular social gatherings.
Awesome. Good to hear.
Are there any other questions out there?
Yeah, I think we're getting pretty close to close, at least for this part. I understand maybe there'll be a sort of an open, some space to speak to each other maybe after. But yeah, maybe last time for a few, or one or two more. Oh, Sarah, you might be muted if you're talking.
Yeah, I'm just seeing a couple more comments here from Bill. Our Anglican Church is very connected. We all have people to connect with, and there's a list of people who can go for supplies. We just took a course on our gifts. Mine is caring for people and communicating about social issues. It's a great community. Churches are very valuable if they have the right leadership. Yeah, just more expressions of thanks. Yeah, as Ian said, I'm gonna hang around here for a little while as the host, and I think there's a few people that may want to share. Haiti, this would be a good time for you to speak if you're interested. Yeah, so thank you so much, Ian. This has been very inspiring.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, and I'd love maybe I could add just a final few words.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Again, yeah, thank you all for spending some of your time here, and to ReThink, and Sarah and Cynthia and others that invited me to speak and make this happen. I think if I could leave you with anything, it's I think to recognize that, I mean, now is the moment. I mean, if there's ever a time when there was a wondering of like, well, someday I might do that thing, or really bring attention or focus to this desire, this beauty making that I've wanted to do but haven't, or maybe you don't know, but this is the time to turn to it. I really want to encourage the sense, not so much of the doing per se, because of course we're under a particular moment of lockdown or reflection, so many of us, but to really use this time to excavate and to be disciplined. And the word discipline is the same root as disciple, which really means to bring a kind of attentive willingness, a courage to a path, and that life. I fully believe that life is trying to communicate with us all the time. This is what I've really come to understand and have a relationship to. And the way that we communicate with life, or that we attune to life, is actually through our bodies, which now makes sense that our bodies are life as well, and they have their own intelligence. And there's a lot of work being done around, of course, somatic therapy, trauma healing, and all the rest. that's really vital, because what it does is it means we're better channels to tap into and understand, again, what do we respond to, what brings us joy, and that's like a compass for us to follow. Like, not that everything has to be happy, but a kind of soulfulness as well is part of the orientation. So what is soulful? What brings us beauty, or how do we participate in beauty in this time? I think if we can attune to that instead of the fear and the anxiety and the rest, and be pragmatic, certainly, in terms of, again, how to prepare well, and just, be stocked up, and not too stocked up, and, leave more toilet paper for others and all the rest, but that there is a real opportunity in this time, and that, it may get rockier, certainly before it gets, quote, better. But I think if we can approach it with that sense of surrender, but surrender to this idea that, who knows, normal may never coming back, and who wants that kind of normal anyway, right? That this is a moment for imagination, for creativity, and for a kind of active love. If you want to see any of my films, most of them are available online on my website, ianmac.com. It's ianmack.com. As well as a podcast I host called The Mythic Masculine, which is really looking at, what does it mean? What is masculinity in these times? And I have different guests. My latest one is with a fellow named Day, he makes these beautiful altars out of earth material. And really, the fellow that mentioned labyrinth, building a labyrinth, very much in line with this fellow, Day. And we talk about a lot of this in context of COVID-19 that's going on right now. So I highly recommend you check that out. It's on my website as well. And I think that might be just about it. I believe this talk will also be released on ReThink, maybe on their YouTube, or if you give the connect or contact info, maybe to Sarah, you can receive that also in a link and share that widely afterwards. So again, thank you so much for your time. It's love in the midst of the pandemic, but please stay connected to what life is asking of you.